What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, we're going to take a look at the blank and double game week schedule and how that's going to play a part in determining when we use our chips for the rest of the season. Last night, the FA Cup 5th round was complete, so we know the results for that. We also know the quarter-final draw. So while not every single blank and double game week is 100% confirmed, we do have a much clearer outlook and can decide when to use those chips. And spoiler alert, a lot of people are going to wildcard early now based on what happened yesterday. So I'll go through that as we go. We'll start off with a quick recap about the next double game week we have, which is double game week 27. 4 teams are going to double that week. So Brighton, Brentford, Southampton and Crystal Palace. I've got to be honest, for most people, you're probably not going to be looking at Southampton and Crystal Palace players. The only two I'd really want to even consider are James Ward-Prowse at Southampton and Zaha if he was fit and available for Crystal Palace. But the problem is their double in 27 is not great. Southampton have got Man United away and Brentford at home. Palace have got Man City at home and Brighton away. And while they do play in game week 28, Southampton have got Spurs at home and Palace have got Arsenal away. The fixtures afterwards are a bit better for Palace, but I just don't think they're worth taking up a spot in our squads. There's much better players that you can target. It's a little bit different for Brighton and Brentford. So with Brighton, they've got a double in 27 and 29, but they don't play in game week 28. Now, if you look at the fixtures a little bit longer term, yes, they've got tough ones in game weeks 30 and 31, 2 away games to Spurs and Chelsea, but as you'll find out later, Brighton also have 3 other double game weeks coming down the line, so they've got 5 in total, so you're going to want to carry Brighton players through. And to be honest, if you go for an attacker like Matoma, March and McAllister, they're 5.4 million or less anyway, so very benchable if you need to. And the defenders and goalkeepers are also 5 million or less, so they're very easy to fit in and definitely worthwhile considering because attacking-wise, they're doing really well right now. And getting to play Leeds, Palace at home, Brentford at home and Bournemouth away in 2 doubles, that looks pretty good to me. Now with Brentford, it's a little bit different. They don't have loads of doubles down the line, but they do now play in game week 28 because Leicester lost to Blackburn in the FA Cup. They also have a double in 27 and 29. Now, their double in 29 is not great. It's Brighton away and Man United away, but I think that's a small price to pay for the fact they've got Fulham, Everton away, Southampton away, and then Leicester at home. It could be one of the reasons that if you're not sure about wildcarding right now, but you don't necessarily want to save it until later on in the season, you could save it until 29 and just have less Brentford players in your team. But ultimately, whether or not you've got a wildcard or not, they do look like a pretty good team to target. Obviously, with Ivan Toney, there's the yellow card suspension, there's the charges that have been brought against him. If you didn't want to go for him, then Mbommo might be a slightly safer pick. Raya is the top scoring goalkeeper. There's defenders to choose from there as well with me, Pinnock and Henry as well. So there's lots of options there, but that is double game week 27. Let's take a look at blank game week 28. So now the FA Cup 5th round is complete. We know who's going to play in game week 28 and also who's going to blank. And it's probably not quite as bad as we first thought. So one result that I already mentioned was that Leicester lost to Blackburn. That means Brentford versus Leicester is on. The big news from last night was that Southampton and Spurs were in separate games. Southampton had Grimsby and Spurs had Sheffield United. Only one of them needed to win and then they blank in game week 28, but they both lost. So Southampton versus Spurs is also on in game week 28. That means Harry Kane has Wolves away in 26, Nottingham Forest at home in 27, that looks really nice. Southampton away, of course, in 28 and Everton away in 29. So when a lot of people built their wildcard 26 drafts, myself included on yesterday's video, there was no Harry Kane in sight, but I think that will change even though they don't have a double in 29. So that's something worth considering, especially if you're someone that already owns Kane and weren't sure about wildcard, and you could now keep him all the way through. And because Leeds lost to Fulham, obviously Wolves and Leeds will be on as well. So there's 6 teams that are going to blank: Brighton, Man United, Liverpool, Fulham, Man City and West Ham. I think first thoughts are there's less need to have to free hit in this week because a lot of people will have triple Arsenal, Kepa from Chelsea, maybe 1 or 2 players from Wolves and Leeds, maybe Harry Kane. Obviously Brentford players are kind of key because they've got the double in 27 as well. And then maybe there's other players left over from the other ones like Trippier, Watkins, Mings, etc. Right? So most people are not going to need to free hit. That doesn't mean that you can't look at it still, because if you want to go for triple Brighton, you maybe want to carry through Rashford, for example. Maybe some of you want to hold on to at least one Liverpool player. After all, they do have Bournemouth away in 27 and a double in 29, and obviously Haaland from Man City. There might still be value in using the free hit, but for most people that's just not going to be needed now, and especially if you wildcard in 26 or 27, you can definitely get through 28 without having to use your free hit. The only thing I would say, because of the schedule in the future, which we'll talk about in a minute, there is less need to kind of hold on to that free hit. So if you think you can get a lot of value out of it in game week 28, you could definitely still consider it. So just a quick recap about double game week 29, because we already knew it was happening. So I would say the teams with the best fixtures are probably Bournemouth, who've got Fulham at home and Brighton at home. Now there's not a huge amount of players from Bournemouth I would consider from an FPL perspective outside of maybe Dominic Solanke, because he's nailed on and on penalties, but you'd only go there if you really needed a cheap forward. There's not really anyone else that I would consider. Brighton, you already know the players that are good from there. We've discussed them a lot. Brentford at home, Bournemouth away, and they've got the double in 27, of course. Nottingham Forest have got Wolves at home, Leeds away, which isn't too bad, but I think they're in a similar position to Bournemouth, where the only real player you'd want to consider is probably Brennan Johnson, who's also on penalties and nice and cheap, but we've only got 3 forward spots, and a lot of people want to keep hold of Haaland. Kane now looks a lot better than he did before last night's FA Cup results. Watkins has got Bournemouth at home in 28 and doubles in 29. Tony, obviously, if you want to take that risk over the suspensions and stuff, Fulham double, Leicester double. So it's hard to find a spot to fit in someone like Brennan Johnson or Solanke. But I guess if money was tight for the draft that you put together, or if money is tight with transfers and stuff like that, you could consider them. Leicester have got Palace away and Aston Villa at home. If you really needed a cheap goalkeeper, you could look at Danny Ward. But I think whether or not you're wildcarding or making goalkeeper transfers, you're probably looking at different combinations like De Gea, Areola from West Ham's only 4.3 million. Obviously, a lot of people looking at Raya, Sanchez from Brighton. They're all probably better options than Danny Ward at the moment. Chelsea, not great because they've got Liverpool, but it is 2 home games. So obviously, Kepa looks good. You could take a risk on Reece James, maybe João Felix, but again, at this point in time, I think there's better forwards to target. And then Man United have got Newcastle away, Brentford at home. So the usual suspects, Fernandes, Rashford for minutes and just attacking output. Luke Shaw, if he's fit, is probably the best defender. And then David De Gea if you need a goalkeeper. And lastly, I don't think Newcastle's fixtures are that bad, but most people are just going to target defenders anyway. We all know about Trippier. And then West Ham, pretty good. Southampton at home, Newcastle at home. I'm not quite sure if they fit in with most people's strategies, but I think Danny Ings' minutes will be pretty good. 2 home fixtures, he could definitely do well there. Bowen is a punt in midfield, and like I just mentioned, Areola is a goalkeeper, while Fabianski is out for a little while. So 12 teams are going to double in 29. That is definitely the biggest double game week left this season. And for some of you, if you're well set up for 26, 27, 28, and you're not too sure about, being stuck with a lot of players from this week that you don't want going forward, you could possibly free hit this week, but it's all going to depend on your team setup. So because there were more FA Cup upsets in the 5th round than maybe some of us thought there would be, Blank Game Week 32 looks quite similar to Blank Game Week 28 in that it doesn't look that difficult to navigate because there will be 8 fixtures on, 7 of which were already confirmed. The other one I'll talk about in a minute. And as a side note, because of the upsets, and don't get me wrong, it's great for the teams that went through and won, but from an FPL perspective only, it means less blank game weeks, which in turn means less double game weeks and probably a lot less excitement for the rest of the season. So it's easier to plan, but there's less chaos, and that chaos is often where a lot of people will start climbing up the ranks. So if you haven't got hardly any of your chips left, the rest of the season is going to be much easier to manage. If you do have your chips left, you're still in a strong position, but it's not going to be as effective as it might have been if Spurs had gone through, for example, or Leicester had gone through and stuff like that. But it is what it is. Back to game week 32, the most important confirmed fixtures on are probably Arsenal versus Southampton. So for anyone with a triple up that doesn't have any chips, yes, they don't double in 29, but it probably doesn't matter because their single game week fixtures are so good you can just carry them all the way through. For anyone that does have a free hit left and is maybe wildcarding soon or not, because Arsenal don't double in 29, you could look to move not necessarily all 3 of them, but 1 or 2 onto double game week players and then think about getting them back later on. But either way, from now until the end of the season, Arsenal don't have any double game weeks, nor do they have any blank game weeks. So that's worth considering depending on what chips you've got left. Obviously, Leicester, because they lost, Leicester versus Wolves is on. So if you want the likes of Maddison, because they play in 28, double in 29 and play in game week 32, you could look at that. Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest is interesting. We already knew that one would be on. I think because Liverpool Liverpool's double is tough in game week 29. Most people are going to look to kind of sell them on. But as you'll find out later, they do also probably double in game week 34. So they've got a double then, which looks pretty good. I think the rest of the fixtures for the season are pretty decent as well. And they've got Nottingham Forest at home in what will be a very small blank game week. I know a lot of people don't want Liverpool players right now, but it might be worth thinking about how you get them in later on if you need them, because that is a good fixture in 32, and then they've got the double in 34 as well. And the players are quite expensive, so it's not like Brighton players where you can just get them in very easily. You've got to think about how you get the money and who you're going to take out. So Harry Kane, for example, looks really good now because he doesn't blank in 28, but he also has no doubles. So he might be the way that you get the money to go back to Salah later on down the line. And I know right now nobody wants Mo Salah, but you all said that before double game week 25, and look what happened. So it's just something to consider. And because Spurs went out, Trippier and Kane and obviously all the other players from Newcastle and Spurs will also play in game week 32. So the blanks that are likely are Brighton and Man City, and then one of Man United and Chelsea, or Fulham and Leeds will also blank, and that is based on the FA Cup draw. So Man City are scheduled to play Brighton in game week 32, and they've been kept separate in the draw. So if Man City beat Burnley or Brighton beat Grimsby, they will both blank in game week 32. So it seems very likely that will happen, because you'd expect both of those teams to win those fixtures. Because Man United and Fulham have been drawn against each other, obviously only one of them can blank. So if Man United beat Fulham, Man United and Chelsea will be a blank in game week 32. If Fulham beat Man United, then their game will be off instead. So just to go back here, if Fulham win, Fulham and Leeds will be off. If Man United win, Man United and Chelsea will be off. So there's only going to be 2 fixtures that blank. Now that might look like a reason not to free hit that week, but it could still be valuable. So if you are someone that's going to drop some of your Arsenal players in game week 29 for doublers, or you're not going to want Liverpool players back in general, then you might be low on players from those teams. So you could free hit to get rid of your Brighton players, which you're probably going to want to keep for most of the rest of the season. A lot of people have Haaland, so that's already 2 to 4 players that are going to blank. You might have Rashford, etc. You could get rid of all them, triple up on Arsenal, triple up on Liverpool, and then just pick 5 players from the other fixtures. Maybe you take a punt on Danny Ings or Jared Bowen against Bournemouth away, for example. So although free hit in game week 32 is much less effective now and much less needed, it could still be a way to gain a bunch of points over someone that doesn't have that chip. So how many double game weeks are we actually going to get after game week 29? Now, interestingly, it's likely that only 6 fixtures are going to need to be rescheduled before the end of the season. The only way that can drop to 5 is if Brighton and Man City both get knocked out of the FA Cup quarter-final. Never say never, but that does seem unlikely. The only way it would increase now is because of real-world events, like we've seen postponements in the past for the Queen's death, COVID, weather, and that kind of thing. Ultimately, from cup competitions, there should be no more blank fixtures, and therefore no more double game week fixtures other than the 6 you see here. Now that means that any future doubles are going to be a lot smaller than the one in game week 29. We're not going to be in a position where 12 teams are all doubling in 1 week. So for anyone that was thinking of holding the wildcard until game week 33 to basically cover the rest of the season, including double game week 34 and 37, that is still a perfectly viable strategy, especially if your team looks good now. It's just not going to be as powerful as it would have been if more Premier League teams had gone through in the FA Cup, like Leicester, Spurs, etc. So if your team is really well set up now in terms of the number of Brighton and Brentford players you're happy with, you can get through the blank in 28, the double in 29, and everything looks good, then of course you save your wild card. But if you've got a bunch of deadwood to get rid of, and you can get better players for the blank, better players for the double, etc., it might just be worth pulling that wild card a little bit earlier, because as we've seen, blank game week 28 and blank game week 32 are just not going to be as difficult to manage. It doesn't mean that there's no benefit to saving the wildcard. If you look at the fixtures that have to be rescheduled, Brighton, Man United, Liverpool, Fulham, Man City, West Ham, they are all the fixtures from blank game week 28. When they do end up doubling, a lot of people are going to be on 0 Liverpool players. You might use that as a differential to get 2 or 3. Man City, a lot of us are going to have Haaland, but not many people are going to have an extra midfielder like Foden, De Bruyne, maybe Mahrez, Grealish, whoever's in favour at the time, possibly a defender if any of them actually look nailed on. And obviously with Man United, we probably would carry them through, and I'll talk about that later. But so it does give the late wildcard a bit of an advantage, but that advantage has been diminished based on the FA Cup results. So these are the 6 fixtures, the 3 I just mentioned: Newcastle versus Brighton, Brighton versus Man City, and then one of Man United versus Chelsea or Fulham versus Leeds, which will depend on who wins out of Man United and Fulham in the quarterfinals of the FA Cup. What you probably have noticed is 6 of those fixtures, 3 of them include Brighton. So Brighton have got 2 doubles on the horizon, 27 and 29, and they'll also have 3 future double game weeks after that. They look key to any squads right now. I don't know why most people wouldn't have 2 to 3 Brighton players if they can. Now, how is that actually going to look later on in terms of where they get put in? I took this prediction from Talha. I've probably pronounced that name wrong. I do apologise, but you should go and follow them on Twitter. They're really keyed in with where fixtures might go. And they think that in double game week 34, there'll be 6 teams doubling. So Brighton, Man United, Liverpool, Fulham, Man City, West Ham. Double game week 37 will have 4 teams doubling. So 2 extra fixtures, Brighton versus Man City, and then one of the 2 games from either Man United versus Chelsea or Fulham versus Leeds. And then they think that Newcastle versus Brighton could go into double game week 36. Now, the reason I've put 2 asterisks there are the 3 there's 4 kind of fixture gurus that I usually kind of listen to for this stuff. So Talha, Lego Mane, Planet FPL, and Ben Crellin on Twitter. They've all got slightly different thoughts on where that Newcastle-Brighton game could go. Ben thinks it could go anywhere in about 5 different game weeks. Talha thinks game week 36, and James from Planet FPL thinks game week 31. So it's difficult to know. You just need to know that at some point that fixture is going to go in. So holding 1 to 2 Newcastle players and 2 to 3 Brighton looks pretty good. You can also take a look on FPL.team. So James has actually put his predicted fixtures in there. The only slight difference is he thinks one of the games from 37 will go into 34 instead. So Liverpool, he's got Dublin in 34, Man City, Dublin, and Man United, as well as Brighton, but also thinks the Fulham versus Liverpool fixture could go into 34. If that does happen, then suddenly it's interesting. You could wildcard to get 2 to 3 Liverpool, make sure you've got 2 to 3 Man City for Fulham away, West Ham at home, get to however many Man United players you want. Maybe there's a bit of an advantage there, but it's definitely going to be lessened because of the way the double game weeks and the extra fixtures that need to be rescheduled are. So it's not an exact science to where they're going to go, but ultimately game week 34 and 37 are going to have a lot less fixtures than we maybe initially thought, and therefore a later wildcard is still viable, it's just less powerful. Alright, but what if you're an FPL manager without any chips? How are you going to manage the rest of the season? I'm primarily talking about no wildcard and no free hit, so I've put this information together which might be useful. There's 8 teams that have at least 1 double before the end of the season and also don't blank. So in brackets I've put the weeks that they double. So for Brentford, for example, they double in 27 and 29. For Newcastle, they double in 29 plus 1 game week in the future. We're not quite sure exactly when that will be. I still think from this list you can probably ignore Southampton and Crystal Palace. Obviously Aston Villa, you've got the likes of Mings and Watkins who could be useful. The blank in 28, they've got Bournemouth at home followed by a double. That looks quite good. Brentford we talked about quite a lot. Tony and Bomo, one of the defenders, maybe Raya as well. Leicester, Maddison, Iheanacho, possibly Danny Ward. Trippier we know from Newcastle. I think a double up on Newcastle defence looks pretty good. Obviously you can pick from Burn, Shah or Botman depending on your budget. And then you've also got 2 teams. One will double and blank, one will double and not blank, and it all depends on who wins out of Man United and Fulham in the FA Cup. The likelihood is that Man United will win that game, so Chelsea will end up blanking in game week 32 but double in 29, and Leeds probably again less relevant to us from an FPL point of view because their double in 29 is not that good even if they don't end up blanking in 32. So that shouldn't put you off Chelsea players, especially like Kepa in goal for example, because you can couple him with a goalkeeper that does play in game week 32 and then you haven't got any issues there. So that's probably useful to know. And then there are 4 teams that don't blank at all, but they also don't have any double game weeks for the rest of the season. That is Arsenal, Spurs, Everton and Wolves. Now, to be honest with you, with the way things have worked out, you can probably just ignore Everton players for the most part. I don't think anyone needs their attackers. If you've got Tarkowski, maybe he's not a huge priority to get rid of, but he's not someone you necessarily need. And I think it's a similar situation with Wolves. I just don't think there are any defenders or attackers that are so good that they would warrant a place in our sides. Doesn't mean you have to go out of your way to get rid of them, but I'm not sure I'd be buying them. Arsenal and Spurs is a little bit different. I think when you don't have wildcards and free hits, you cannot have the perfect team every week. So in some game weeks, you're going to have to sacrifice double game weekers to keep hold of good single game weekers instead. And remember that if a team doesn't blank and another team blanks once and doubles once, they both have the same fixtures over a span of game weeks. Obviously, you can use transfers to gain fixtures there and then get rid of them before they blank. But if you've got no chips, you're not going to be able to do that over and over. So keeping hold of 2 to 3 Arsenal players and possibly Harry Kane looks pretty good as well. But this is primarily for people that don't have their wildcard or free hit. All right, but what if you have still got your wild card? When should you be looking to use it? So as I've already mentioned, because there are so few fixtures to reschedule later on in the season, the power of a late wild card is definitely less than it could have been. That doesn't mean you can't still go with that strategy, and I'm definitely not trying to put anyone off, right? You should go with the strategy that you're most comfortable with. That might be wild carding in game week 30, for example. So you use transfers over the next few weeks, you get to however many double game week players you want for 29, and then you just get rid of any you don't want to hold long term. So for example, anyone that wildcards now will probably go triple Brentford, but you might not want triple Brentford for the rest of the season. You might only want them up until that double in 29. So by wildcarding, you get to get rid of all those players and just only focus on the rest of the season. So that could be one reason to go in game week 30. You could look at game week 33, which people were considering before. So that would set you up for the rest of the season, including the doubles in 34 and 37. And if your team looks pretty good right now, you could absolutely go for that strategy. That is the key decision. How does my team look right now? When I look at my own team, I've got no Brighton, no Brentford. I've got Dwight McNeil and James Tarkowski. Now, don't get me wrong, Tarkowski can be benched, and McNeil I knew I would have to deal with, but there is all of a sudden a few different things that a wildcard would just solve in one go, and it looks like the rest of the season is going to be much easier to navigate. So I feel like my team needs a wildcard sooner rather than later. You might not be in that position. If you want to save it, you absolutely should. What if you are looking to use it sooner rather than later? And I don't mean 26 specifically. It could be 26, 27, 28, 29 even, right? What are the reasons why you might change which week you use it in? So with 26, you can prepare for double game week 27 and 29 at the same time, and you can clear any deadwood that I've just spoken about. You also get an extra transfer over wildcarding in game week 27. So that's only a minor thing. It might not matter too much to you. You might not value that, but you could then roll in 27 as long as there's no injuries. You'd have 2 transfers going into 28, so you could get an additional player that plays that week if you wanted to, and then you go into the double in 29 with 2 transfers, and at that point, if you wanted to get rid of all your Arsenal players, for example, which I'm not necessarily saying is a good strategy, but you could get rid of them for double game week players instead. So if I've got Odegaard, Saka and Gabriel, I might sell Gabriel to Luke Shaw, Odegaard to Fernandes, and Saka to a different player that doubles. And by having 2 free transfers in 29, that allows me to do it. Whereas someone that wildcards in 27 might go for a very similar team, but they won't have as many transfers when they get to 29. So that's just one thing to consider. It's very minor. I wouldn't panic too much. If your team looks good for 26, you could absolutely delay 1 week. Obviously, if you do delay, you've got an extra week of information. What's going on with injuries to Estupiñán, March, what's happening with Tony's suspension and stuff like that. They're all things that you can consider. And obviously, like I said, your team might be fine for game week 26. You could go into game week 28 or wildcard in game week 28. I know that doesn't sound I know that sounds a bit crazy because obviously there's a blank, but it does work. It would allow you to go for more Leicester players if you wanted to. So again, if you wanted to drop down some of your players you feel you need for 26 and 27 but don't need after that, you could put James Maddison in the team instead, for example, hold him for the double in 29, and also the fixtures after that aren't too bad. It would also reduce the need for Brentford players long term. So the reason Brentford is so key before 28 is because of the 2 doubles in 27 and 29. But after that double in 27, yes, they've still got one in 29, but so do lots of other teams. So you might not want as many Brentford players in your team if you were to wildcard in 28. Again, we are talking about very, very minor differences. If you're happy just to use it in 26, then you should just do that. And in game week 29, you obviously get game week 27 or the double in 27 and the blank in 28 out of the way. You're only concentrating on the double in 29 and then the rest of the season. You could possibly include like 1 or 2 Liverpool players on that. I know the double in 29 isn't great, but they play in blank game week 32 and they probably double in 34 as well. So it's just something to consider. Like I said, there's not a huge amount of differences. I think a lot of people will go 26. The ones that don't will probably just go in 27 and just take that extra week's worth of info. All right, but what about the rest of the chips? Now, a lot of this is going to depend on your combination of chips, but also when you play one might affect when you use the other one. So I'll try and cover it as best as I can. If you've got the wildcard and the free hit, and you're wildcard in late, so game week 30 or later, then you may need to use the free hit to cover the blank in 28 or possibly the double in 29. Obviously, if your team looks perfect for 26 to 29 and you don't need the free hit, then you could wildcard and free hit later if you wanted to. But I think for most people, it's probably going to be worth just using the free hit now if you're going to wildcard later. If you're wildcarding soon, so game weeks 26 or 27, which is probably what I'm going to do, I think the free hit is kind of open to when you want to use it. If you get into blank game week 32 and you want to keep triple Brighton, Haaland, Man United players who all might blank, and you also want to get more Liverpool for Nottingham Forest and more Arsenal for Southampton, then you could use it then. If you navigate through that, you could just use it in one of the double game weeks. Failing that, you just use it in a random week and hope things go well, right? If you've got the free hit but no wildcard, it's much more difficult to know exactly when to use it. It's going to be very dependent on your team. If you're well set up for the doubles in the short term and the blank in 28, then you could just hold it for later on in the season, possibly for the blank in 32 or the double in 34. If you're well set up for the doubles in 27 and 29, but not the blank in 28, then you could use it there, right? And then obviously manage the rest of the season. I think for people that have got free hit but no wildcard, you're probably going to be more needed to use it in a blank game week. And also, you're probably worth going back to the chipless section where I went through all the teams that don't have blanks. So you might want to target a few more of those as well. If you've got wildcard and no free hit, then it's kind of similar to the wildcard question I already or the wildcard section I already did, right? If your team is fine now and you're absolutely happy with how you're going to manage the next few weeks, use it later. If you're not, just use it now because the rest of the season should be easy enough to manage without the free hit. Bench boost when you have a good bench, of course. I know that sounds obvious. Most people, it's going to be game week 29 because there's so many teams that are doubling. But ultimately, it really does depend when you play the chips. If you wildcard in game week 33 still, you might want to bench boost that week as well. Some people that wildcard this week, they'll probably bench boost in 29. Some might bench boost in game week 27. So, for example, if you wanted to go for Raya and Sanchez as your goalkeeper combination, so Raya doesn't blank, Sanchez has got a bunch more doubles coming later on for Brighton. Well, if you bench boost in 27, you can have both of those goalkeepers playing at the same time, right? So that is an option as well. Obviously, you could do that in 29, but it depends on how you want to set your team up. But ultimately, there's no specific week that is best, but for a lot of people, it's probably going to be 29. Triple captain in a week you're not using a chip. Now you are if you want to use it on a double game week play, you are starting to get limited about where you can use it, and a lot of it is going to have to factor into when you use other chips. So if we just go back to FPL.team and look at the projections from James. So you could use it in game week 27, either on a Brentford player or a Brighton player. I don't think most people are going to want to do that. You could definitely use it in game weeks 29, but neither Arsenal or Man City or Spurs have a double. So it's quite difficult to choose who to play on. Most people would probably go on a Man United player like Rashford for Newcastle away, Brentford at home. You could definitely do that, but of course if you want to play your bench boost that week, you don't have the option. So then you're looking further ahead. You're probably not going to want to go game week 31 for the Brighton Newcastle double. It's just not good enough. So then it's game week 34. So you've got Salah, Spurs at home, Fulham at home. If you want to go a bit differential, you've of course got Haaland, Fulham away, West Ham at home. That looks good. Or you've got Man United again, Villa at home, Brighton away. Now, if I had the triple captain left, I would use it on one of those three teams in game week 34. But if you want to bench boost that week, or free hit, or even wildcard, who knows what you want to do, then you can't use the free hit the same week. So you'll have to decide elsewhere. So when it comes to the triple captain, I think 34 looks best from the game weeks we've got left. but that's going to depend on where you use your chips. So hopefully that was useful. There was a lot to go through. In terms of specifics for a Game Week 26 wildcard draft, I'll try and cover that later or in a video tomorrow, because I'm probably going to use the chip myself. I've still got to do team selection. There's still final thoughts to come as well, and a deadline stream. So I'll try and get it covered as best as we can. Obviously, we had to wait until the FA Cup results were finished before we could talk about all this, but I'll leave that one there. Give it a like, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you again, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. I don't know right now.